Well, there are so many sponsors here tonight. I'd like to thank all of them, and it's always a great pleasure to come over to Perth and to see old friends who are here tonight, including Ray and Trish Todd and others. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and let me say it was a bit of a surprise when I got invited by the Fair Work Commission to write the first of the series of papers that they are now producing, with the idea, I think the concept is that it should be papers that speak to issues of our time, issues that are of interest not just to academics but to practitioners and students and others. And it was not my choice to focus on employee communication. And I actually had to go off and do quite a bit of work on this subject to get up to speed, because I know that this is a subject that now, you know, whole degrees can be obtained in the field of communication, and of course it's an industry in itself. And of course, as I got to grips with some of these things, I realized that in some ways we are very much in the hands of the communicators or those in the communications industry. And so I want to kind of bring it a bit more down to earth tonight and try to locate issues of communication where I think they really start and finish, or should start and finish, which is at the workplace level. And I also want to connect it with something that I suppose is a bit of a fad. It's become the kind of buzzword of today, of this era, and that is employee engagement. And I've put the question mark against my own title, saying, is this an elusive quest? And the argument I want to put to you tonight, when I can get this going, is that this is a mission on which many of us have been engaged. Many of you, no doubt, have been involved for many years, and it's like the kind of holy grail. Many people would argue that if you can get communications right in the workplace, then you solve a lot of problems that might later become industrial relations matters. Now, I want to challenge some of that, but I also want to really focus on four main themes. One is, well, the first is that employee communication, when it is connected with involvement and engagement, are key ingredients in employment relations and productive workplaces. Now, that's probably not a very controversial statement, but I guess there are those who would say, well, this is all a bit superficial. It's all about the rules and regulations. And of course it is that as well, but I think we have often forgotten or neglected these other issues. And I want to connect that with social and technological change, because when I was talking to one of my adult children about this, she said, look, Dad, these days, you know, it's all about Twitter and iPhones, and, you know, don't get bogged down in sort of the past. Really try to get with it. Now, that's a bit of a challenge for me. I don't have a Twitter account, but I do recognise that what we're dealing with today is a very different system of communication and the availability of information that was not there before. Many things that could be hidden from employees and employers in the past are now much more transparent than they were. So this, I think, gives this whole issue of communications a much more vital presence. Now, of course, many of us in this room, and I guess Ray and I were talking about this, we're kind of industrial relations tragics. You know, we go back to the Accord and all those, the golden era. And we still, of course, have enterprise agreements, we have Fair Work Commission, and it's not surprising that in many Wanda Awards enterprise agreements, employee communication engagement is being represented. And I want to present some examples of where this is being done, where the parties, the industrial parties, are addressing issues of communication. And I was saying to Ray, I just saw recently an agreement that's been signed by Rio and the CFMEU that explicitly, and it relates to automation in the mines, and it explicitly addresses the issue of how employees and union members to be informed and involved in decisions about the application of automation in mining. And I was saying to Ray that I'm currently involved in a European Union project on this issue of the mines of the future, and I've had the opportunity, in fact next week I'll be going back to Sweden to look at one of the most automated mines in the world up in the Nordic countries, up in Kiruna in the Arctic Circle, and it has just amazed me how far technology has gone. Almost, you could say, a mine which does not have miners, but the people who are doing the mines, who are driving the machines, who are manipulating the technology, are up on the surface. Of course, they are still people in the mines, but a lot of that is to do with the application of information technology and its communication of a different type, but it does... when I asked people there recently about the kind of issues, they said, well, it's developing new methods of teamwork and so forth among the new miners, the people who might have been school teachers or nurses or public servants who are now manipulating the equipment that once upon a time involved big, brawny men way down in mines. So what we are also addressing are these innovative procedures or methods that have come into being as the technology changes. So let me just proceed to my introduction. And just to demonstrate how long in the tooth I am, let me tell you that ironically, when I was asked by our colleagues at the Fair Work Commission to do something on communication, I thought, hang on, this was one of the first things I ever did. When I was in Britain, just finishing off my doctoral thesis, having worked for British Airways for several years while I did my studies, I was asked by something called the Commission on Industrial Relations that had been set up by the Labour government but had been continued by the Conservative government. We're talking pre-Thatcher era. This period was in the early 70s. And the Commission on Industrial Relations later became ACAS, which is the equivalent of Fair Work Commission in Britain, said we want to have a series of research papers. And one of the papers we want is on communications. And they advertised some positions, and I applied and got one of these part-time things. And they sent me up to the north to a place called York, and they said, we want you to investigate communications in the printing industry. So off I went to this printing company, and it was a very old-fashioned company, but it was a very important one in the city of York. And like many of the companies in those days, it had the works out the back, the printing works were out the back, and the office was at the front, and they were separated. And I went in there with a few questions to ask, and naively, one of the first questions I asked people out in the factory area, the printing area, and the office was, is there some technological change that has happened here recently that has had an impact on the way you work? And to a person, they answered the same thing. They said, we now have a telephone. I thought, well, that's really, you know, we're really at the cutting edge of technology here. And I said, a telephone? Well, that must have improved things. Oh, no, they said, that has set back communications you wouldn't believe. It's been a disaster in terms of our communications. And when I inquired a little further, they said, well, before we had the telephone connecting the works, the printing works and the office, the guys out in the factory used to come and see us, and the women in the office used to come up and see us in the factory, and we actually knew each other. We used to talk about problems. We used to solve problems or solve issues before they became problems. Now, you know, we get this telephone call and it's all very impersonal. Now, it's a very simplistic, and of course my report was about more than that, but I think it gave a very interesting insight into the fact that a small, or you know, a small step forward, if you like, of putting in a piece of technology that is designed to assist communications can often work against communications because it intrudes into the social system. And of course, as I'll say in a little bit later, we have known for a long time, haven't we, that the social and technological systems in our workplaces are really interconnected. And so when we talk about communications, we are talking not just about the social relationships between people, but more and more we're talking about the kind of technologies that is coming in to play. Now, I told this story to my daughter, and she said, "Oh, Dad, you know, don't talk about the 1970s. They'll pigeonhole you as some old bloke. Talk about Google. That's where it's all at." So I thought, okay, I better go and look at Google. So I Googled Google, and up came the workplace image of Google. And there's Google, you know. And I read a bit more about Google, and I could see that, you know, it's all about having coffee and sitting in lounge chairs, playing ping pong, billiards. Wonderful, wonderful. But I was actually interested in finding out, where do these people work? Do they just sit there all day? No, I found they're absent from work. There's no one there. Now, I made the mistake of showing this at a conference a few weeks after I'd done this, and there was the HR director of Google Australia, and she came back and upbraided me afterwards for, you know, denigrating Google, who had won the best communications prize in North America. But I said, look, I'm puzzled. Not only is no one at work, are they all working in the restaurant? But I said, to me, this looks like the 1930s. You could have gone to an office in the 1930s and seen people all sitting in little rows, in little cubicles. She said, no, this is open plan, open communication. Well, I haven't done the research in Google, but I'm somewhat skeptical. I think, you know, when we design workplaces, surely we should be finding places where people work in a more socially related place than what I see there. However, I shouldn't knock Google because, you know, they're up there with the new ideas, but perhaps they need to do some more work on how they actually design the place where they are supposed to work. And in fact, a couple of people came up to me at this conference and said, "You are spot on. We work at Google, and boy, you know, the difference between the image and the reality is something else." But I think, putting that aside, we can say that what we're demonstrating here is that the connection between the social and the technical. And this is not a new concept. This is a concept, actually, that an Australian from Western Australia, the son of a shearer from Western Australia called Fred Emery, who went in the 1950s to Britain and became a psychologist. And Emery worked in the mines. He worked in a whole range of things. It was actually the mines where he worked with Eric Trist and a miner called Bamforth, and they examined an issue which sounds very similar to issues that we have today in the mining industry. They found that in the early 1950s, Britain was trying to modernize their mines. They put in they call it mechanization in those days. They put in mechanization with the great promise of productivity. And what happened? Productivity went down. Surprise. Why do you think property went down? Now, if we were in a small class, I'd be very interested in your views. Does anyone have a view? Why would mechanization cause a drop in productivity? Any thoughts on that? Yes, my friend. He broke the teams up. This man knows all about this, I'm sure, coming from Britain as he does. Yes, it destroyed the existing social networks, the social relationships in the workplace. And what Emery and his colleagues did, and Emery actually had worked in Western Australia in the early 50s on a very interesting project that was to do with why do farmers not take up more technology. So he was very interested in this issue, and he said what we've got to do is restore the autonomy of those workers over the technology. We've got to give them the tools to work with the technology so they're in charge and the technology is in charge of them. Now, we wouldn't call this communication maybe in the strict sense of the word, but it was very much about people working together, being in charge of their destiny, having authority and autonomy over their work. Now, if I take that to the present, I'll add a point of that, and that is, like many things, the British really didn't take up this idea in a big way. Surprise, surprise, prophets are often, you know, not honoured in their own country. Fred Emery eventually came back to Australia and was honoured, but it was the Nordic countries, it was the Swedes, the Norwegians, the Danes and the Finns who took up a lot of these ideas and are still working with these ideas. And in fact, the mine that I'm talking about in Kiruna still explicitly says we work to a socio-technical system here. We try to integrate the technology and the people. And I had the opportunity to work a decade or so ago with a company called ASEA Brown Bavaria. It was a multi-country study. We looked at 12 countries around the world. Our colleague Mark Bray and I, who's up in Newcastle, we looked at 3 plants, one in Australia, one in Finland, and a place called Vasa. In fact, I'll just show you what I'm talking about here. And also a plant in Geneva. And we looked at these. This is only a small transformer. These are plants that make huge transformers for the electricity generation industry. And the interesting thing we found when we compared these three, I should say, is that the Swiss plant focused very much on product innovation. They said, we're very good at engineering. We are extremely good at discovering things, at doing R&D, and we want to be the premier plant. And I should tell you what the company was saying to all these plants: we don't need 12 plants. We're going to close some of you. So you better tell us what you're good at. So the Swiss plant said, we are really good at product innovation, and look at all the new products we're coming up with, which was true. The Finnish plant in Vasa said, we're really good at teamwork. We're very good at process technology. We've worked out ways to integrate the factory and the office, to give everyone skills so we can interchange people and we can develop different ways of building the products. We can also do some innovation, but our innovation is more around what we might call social innovation in the workplace. What we might also call good communication and teamwork. Sadly, the Australian plant did none of these things. And as a rescue plan, the company sent the head of the Vasa plant, Finnish plant, to Australia. Eric Nieland came for 3 years, and he finished up closing the plant. I used to get him to come to my classes, and he used to tell the students, the master's students, he said, look, I love Australia. I wish I'd come here as a young man. I'm close to retirement. It looks like I'm going to be closing the plant and signing off into retirement. He said, what I see here is great people who have got enormous potential, but I see starved of funds. I see a company that has not gone to the headquarters and said, we demand the best technology. They're working with outdated equipment. They lack the skills because they haven't had the continuous training that we do. And they are in industrial relations conflict between the union and the management because of all these other things. Not because people are necessarily at odds with each other, but because they haven't developed both the technical and the social skills, or the integration of the technology and the people to work together to create the kind of value-added system that they need to survive. So, again, we're not talking about pure communications, but inherent in these success stories, particularly the Vasa plant, I think, is an issue of communication. Now, of course, if I was a technologist, I'd be telling you more about this communications revolution we're in. And if I was able to do more twittering, I might be able to give you illustrations of what this means. But I know from looking at my grandchildren, who are only 6 and 10, but have iPhones and all kinds of stuff, that the access to technology, to social media, is providing people, not just people in the workplace, but outside, with a much greater array of information than I ever had. And what this is doing, I think, is emphasising much more than in the past the importance of leadership in organisations, ensuring that information is shared in an effective and employees are engaged around the product or the tasks that they have. Now, I was telling a friend about all this, a friend of my son's, who sent me this email the other day, and she said, look, I work in the communications industry, I work for Nokia, and this is what's happening these days. We're all communicating, but we're not necessarily communicating with each other. So technology has actually given us the opportunity to communicate with a wider range of people, but often we are not communicating with each other. So, in my view, I see communication as being very interlinked with a subject that I guess has been a bit of an obsession of mine for a long time, and it waxes and wanes in terms of its popularity, but it's the importance of connecting communication with employee and employee involvement and participation. And some colleagues in Brisbane have come, and Britain have come up with a notion of an escalator, which I'll just show you, which is, I'm not that happy with this idea, but I think I would rather see all of these things interconnected. I don't think it's necessarily one step after the other, but I think what they have captured is that there is a process here. There is an interconnection between once you give people information and you communicate it, you're going to have to do more in consultation. In some instances, and I'll give some examples of this, this may lead to more co-determination, more joint decision-making, and ultimately it may lead to a much greater diversity or dispersal of control. So, in fact, I think real communications is a challenge to management, to say, well, you know, we're not in control in the way we once were because we don't have the monopoly over information that we once had. And these colleagues, Mick Marchington from Britain and Adrian Wilkinson up in Brisbane, they have distinguished between the scope of participation and the depth of participation in the workplace. And so I would argue that there is a great deal that we need to do as we develop these new forms of communication using technology to ensure that we give alongside that opportunity for technology greater emphasis on both the scope and depth of participation. So communication needs to be combined with employee involvement, participation, to produce not just more productivity, because in itself this does not create productivity, but more employee well-being. And just to throw in another buzzword, which I guess you've all heard of and which has been with us now for a little time, but which I think, you know, what I'm trying to do is connect some of the dots between some of these different concepts. High involvement workplaces is another thing we've been hearing about for some time now. And I was looking at some work done by a couple of Americans, Eaton and Rubenstein, in a multinational pharmacy company recently, in which they came up with the notion that increased communication and influence, so they were combining communication and influence by employees in organisational decision-making, led to improved employee well-being, better work performance, and higher customer service quality. And they made the point that this is where high-performance work teams can really achieve things if communication is built in and connected to these other matters, problem-solving, decision-making, and so on. And I see this as very much a reflection of the kind of things that I was seeing in the best practice plants in Switzerland and Finland. And they make the final point, or the further point, that we're not just talking about communication up and down the organisation, we're also talking about communication across the organisation. And so often we think about vertical communication, getting the message down or the message up, but it's also empowering people across the different functions. So I've been talking a little bit about Sweden and America and Germany, and Finland and Switzerland. And by doing so, I'm not trying to say that these people are inherently more intelligent or better than us, but we do know in Australia that we are competing with these different countries in many ways, and that there are differences between us, between different countries, in the way that we manage our industrial relations and other aspects. And so these are sometimes in terms of legal requirements, and this is bringing me more towards our current industrial relations system, and those legal requirements in certain countries make it compulsory, make it a requirement for employers to not just provide information, but to provide information which is intelligible and which is explained and in which people are trained to understand the information that they are given. And so we talk about the distinction between, generally speaking, the Northern European countries, which are called coordinate or sometimes described as coordinated market economies of the German Nordic type, versus the liberal market economies of the Anglo-Saxon world, the US, Canada, Australia, Britain, where we do have certain characteristics in common, not just culturally, but in terms of our organisational cultures and our industrial cultures. And we can also draw a distinction between direct and indirect forms of participation and engagement. So typically, indirect forms of participation are where employees are represented on formal bodies, and this is very much the kind of German system where it's laid down in the law, the Nordic system where it's very much something that is being developed through collective bargaining, and so we talk about the dual system in Germany of supervisory and management boards. And under these systems, there is a much greater compulsion of employees to be informed either through law or through practice, through collective bargain agreements, which exist very much in the Nordic countries. Now, these are not saying the companies have to give up or management has to give up the rights to make decisions, but rather it says decisions should be shared and information should be made available. In other words, people should be communicated with about important things that involve them. Now, this is not to say, of course, that we have many good examples in the English-speaking world, in the US, Australia, Britain, and so on. But we tend to focus, I guess, more on individualistic, direct forms of participation, and often this is couched in terms of problem-solving teams. We've had a lot of effort go on in recent years in setting up quality teams and other forms of participation in which employees are involved, joint consultation committees and so on. And at the moment, Fair Work Commission is doing a survey of Australian workplaces, which is hopefully going to give us new information, which we haven't had for about a decade from previous surveys that were done called the Australian Workplace Industrial Relations Surveys. But in the previous two surveys that were done, we saw, at least from the data that was provided, quite a significant increase in Australian companies, Australian organisations, in terms of providing opportunities for workers, employees to be involved in joint consultation activities. So it's not as though we've sat on our hands and done nothing. But what we haven't done, as in some other countries, like the Nordic, German and Nordic countries, is have a combination of the direct and indirect, of giving people both the opportunity to individually participate, but also the legal requirement for people to be informed about things that are going to affect them. Now, in Britain, in recent times, there has been a great, well, going back to 2009, which is a while back, but 5 or 6 years ago, there is still going on quite a lot of discussion about a report commissioned by the Blair government, but it actually was published a bit later, by two people, David McLeod, who was a senior executive with ICI, and Nita Clark, who was a former union official and advisor to Tony Blair. And this report was not focused on industrial relations or communication. It was focused on how can Britain improve its business performance and innovation. And, interestingly, among the most important findings that they came up with, or the evidence that they produced from extensive reviews, interviews and surveys, was that, in their view, Britain was held back by the fact that employees' skills were underutilised and their decision-making or opportunity for decision-making was limited, which led, in their view, to low levels of employee engagement compared with many of the other European countries, particularly the Nordic and German area, where these qualities or these aspects were to be found more prevalent. And they reported, and I quote them here, that employee engagement occurs when employees are committed to their organisational goals and values, and at the same time, these enhance their own their sense of well-being. And they came up with a list of what they called key drivers of employee engagement. And the first of these was communications, effective internal communications, but they linked these with a number of other things. They said it's not just one, it's a package. And you need to have all of these things integrated within an organisation to be innovative and productive. Employee voice throughout the organisation, regular feedback and dialogue between subordinates and superiors. These are their words, not mine. Clarity of job expectations, communicating with people about what is expected. Good quality of working relationships, opportunities for career advancement, and managers who empower their people to give them greater scope. Now, as I said, this is named after McLeod, who was a senior executive with ICI, so it's not some kind of union-oriented thing, but something which was very much debated and discussed in Britain, and I think is very relevant to Australia, given that we have, of course, many things in common. So I'm not saying we should transplant the German or the Nordic system. I'm saying there's a lot in countries that we might compare ourselves as being similar in terms of cultural background. And as I said, I think we are improving. Workplace surveys that have been done, and hopefully when we get the results from Fair Work Commission that they're engaged in at the moment, we will have an opportunity to see on benchmarks over a period of time, are we improving in these areas? And I would hope that is the case. And certainly it's the case that governments, both previous Labor governments and Liberal governments or Conservative governments, have argued for greater participation, involvement in decision-making, but we haven't gone the next step. We haven't said, well, this is so important that we need to lay it down in some form of regulation. Just as we regulate other things like health and safety. We think it's important that people should have these opportunities to be better informed about things broader than simply health and safety. So we have had, and Roy Green, I think you heard of recently, was very much involved in the best practice program that we saw some years ago. But the problem is that many of these good cases have not been diffused more widely. Now, I thought I'd better be up to date, and I'd better have a look at a couple of examples to give you a sense of hope. Because we do have some excellent examples of organisations. Interestingly, the two that I've picked out here are not the BHPs or the Rios or the big corporations, the big multinational corporations. They are small corporations. In one case, an Australian-owned company. In the other, a German-owned company. It just happened to be that I didn't go looking for a German company. It was just that these two companies were highlighted actually by the AMWU in their newsletter earlier this year. So I contacted the union. I said, look, I'd like to go and see these companies. In fact, I knew I had met one of the owners of Anchor last year at a conference, and I had been intending to go there anyway. But I had the opportunity to go and actually have a look at them. Both companies are been operating for about 50 years in Australia, so they're not Johnny-come-latelys or fly-by-nights. And both companies were highlighted by the union, as having excellent systems of communication, strategies and collaboration. These are not my words. These were the words that appeared in the AMW newsletter to their members, saying, here's examples of companies where we, the union and the companies, have built up very good collaboration and good communication, and this has been very good for jobs and wages and training and opportunities for the future. So let's have a quick look at each of these, and I'll try not to drag this out too long so you can have a chance to ask a few questions. This is just from the company magazine, and you can see there it's a company that's working in aerospace and doing a whole range of cutting-edge technology. Here's just a snapshot of showing their happy their happy apprentices. It's a company that was set up by two fellows in Melbourne about 40 years ago, one of whom is an engineer and the other is a tradesman. And they decided, they built their first machine tool 40 years ago, and from that has emerged an Australian-owned company with 800 employees, 75% of whom are in Australia, but increasingly they're moving parts of their operations to China, to Germany, and to the United States, which are their main opportunities, where they see their main future opportunities. Now, what struck me from spending a few days there and having talked to one of the owners previously was that they see one of the key ingredients of their success as being involvement of their employees, and this is from the technician through to the PhD person involved in their R&D, in having everyone engaged in research and development, because, as the owner said, one of the co-owners said, some of the best ideas come from the lathe, the fellow on the lathe, or the woman over here in the office, because we are regularly updating everyone in terms of what's going on. And we're not just talking about 10 people, we're talking about 800 employees spread over quite a large series of workshops. And they invest 10% of their annual revenue in R&D. So the key ingredient, as far as they're concerned, is the integration of people within that company, research scientists, engineers, skilled tradespeople, sales and personnel in the operations of the enterprise. Another company that was instanced or given as an example by the AMW was Hella lighting products. Now, I don't know how many of you look at your car lights, but one of mine went out recently. I got a common, ordinary Toyota, and I looked at it. It was a Hella light, and I think they have something like almost 100% of what used to be the car industry in Australia, but internationally they are the leading lighting manufacturer for automobiles, and this is what that young woman is holding in her hand, who's one of the employees. And this is a group of people at the plant in Melbourne who are employed there, and one of their lights, and they're holding up a light which is it is the centre of excellence worldwide for Hella lighting for the mining industry because of you good people here in Western Australia who are putting their lights into your mines. I guess the Queenslanders are doing something as well. But what Hella has done is also collaborate very well with their workforce. They haven't, in fact, the guy who runs the plant is a Finn, a guy from Finland, but he said, we're not trying to introduce Finnish ideas or German ideas here, but it is true. He said, it is true that I grew up in Finland, I worked in factories there and in Germany, and, you know, we had an ethic there that you do involve people. So they, as he quotes, as I've made this quote here from the interview, our aim is to involve the workforce in design and development of new products from the outset. So again, all employees, up to the point that their abilities allow them, to be involved in multifunctional teams working on the next wave of technology, because unless we, as they say, unless we can be the next product off the floor and capture the new technology in lighting, whether it be in automobiles or in mining, you know, we will just become another history, a piece of history. Now, just to wind up, as we should, with something on enterprise bargaining. As I said before, what we do see under the Fair Work Act and in EBAs and modern awards, that they are now required to include consultation and dispute resolution clauses. Now, this is not particularly new, but it is in there, and there are also statutory requirements, state and federal legislation on consultation on health and safety issues. So we have been doing these things for many years. And some EBAs, and I've got an example in the paper, spell out what is actually required in terms of communication with employees and unions on proposed workplace changes, but this is not always followed up. And I say this on the basis of having talked to people about the implementation side of EBAs. And so I guess what I'm arguing here, based on these examples, is that genuine communication and consultation needs to be embedded in the normal operational activities as we see at Anchor, we see at ABB, and we see at Hella, and integrated with the organisational management rather than being seen as something that is you add in as a new ingredient. Now, in the auditing world, I'm not an auditor, but my colleagues in the finance and accounting tell me, and we read about it all the time in the press, about the importance of auditing how companies are run. But do we hear about auditing of things like communication and engagement? I would argue that we don't. And this is not my ideas. These are ideas I came across in a report by a consultant who was doing some work in one of the companies that I was visiting, who said, look, what we've done in this company is introduce an audit of communication and engagement of employees. So we undertake, or this company undertakes, an annual audit. And if you like, the characteristics of this audit is that it's a well-defined, well-designed and confidential system to enable employees to convey their concerns and suggestions to management. Within this audit, we have established guidelines for effective employee suggestion scheme. Now, suggestion schemes been around a long time and much derided, but let me tell you, Hella, talking to the shop stewards in Hella, they said, look, we have got a genuine suggestion scheme here. We think it's terrific because people take notice of it. So, there are suggestion schemes that we've had for many years that become redundant and lose their value, but there are other situations in which it's all part of the package. Provide opportunities for employees to interact with the management team. Again, very much a characteristic of reducing the distinction or the levels of hierarchy. The managing director of Anchor has a little. Well, he doesn't have an office. He has a desk in the workplace, and in fact, that was one of the characteristics of the plant in Finland, the Asea Brown-Boveri ABB plant, was that Eric Nieland, when he came here, said, I'm going to redesign this plant in Moorebank in Sydney, and I'm going to put my office in the middle of the factory. Because he said, I come to Australia, see all these managers in their little offices, away from everything. What I've found works in my workplaces back in Finland is to put my desk in the middle of the factory, so people can see me, they can come to me. We have meeting rooms, but it's visibility and integrating activity of management and the workforce. So these are all things that I guess we all know, but it's seeing them actually put into action. And of course, it's too often the case that we only really focus on these things when a crisis occurs. And in the case of ABB in Sydney, as Eric said, Eric the Finn said, this was a crisis that I came here. It should have been something that alerted the company to doing something, but unfortunately, it was just all too late. And that saw that plant close. So let me conclude by saying, or by summarising, the argument I've tried to put to you tonight. Firstly, that communication, employee involvement, engagement needs to be broadened and deepened in our enterprises, and that we need the leadership, the kind of leadership we see at Anchor and Heller and ABB, where leaders are committed to these ideas in order to create the more productive workplaces and create employee well-being. I think we have many innovative ideas. We have been a country of innovation in the past. I've only instanced 2 small companies. I'm sure there are many others. I know that Roy Green the other night instanced a very large number, but he said they're still insufficient to create the groundswell that we need to achieve a momentum in this area. So innovative approaches need to be more widely diffused, rather than kept, as a secret behind the closed doors. I think we have a need to combine voluntary and regulatory systems. We accept regulation in certain areas, but regulation tends to be often seen as a bad word, and regulation by itself will not achieve things, but if people voluntarily are engaged within a regulatory framework, I think these initiatives have a longer lifespan. And that has been the case in the Nordic countries, which used not to have very much regulation, have increased regulation to try and ensure that they get longevity and innovation that is more diffused. And I guess finally, to come back to my initial point, social and technological changes, we know, are creating a whole new space, a whole new environment in which people are better informed, but they are informed often by their own initiatives, rather than because organisations have said we need to provide better communications, we need to provide more information, we need to give people a greater opportunity to be involved in decision making. And I think that unless we change these attitudes, then the information which is out there will be used to challenge management, rather than seeing that information that augments what management are trying to achieve. And I think this is an issue not just for the present, it's an issue that will determine very much our future. So I think that's the end. Yes, thank you very much.